The emergency command room had never felt this silent. Doctors, firefighters, police officers, and exhausted nurses stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Smoke still clung to their uniforms. Soot covered their faces. Some had blood on their sleeves that did not belong to them. Every person in the room looked as though they had aged years in a single morning. Just 2 hours earlier, Eastbridge Medical Center had been on the verge of becoming the deadliest hospital fire in state history. Instead, 57 patients had survived. Every one of them. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and respect, hit like and subscribe. These stories inspire change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Emily Carter. Hospital Director Richard Lawson stood at the head of the conference table. His usually perfect suit was stained with ash, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. The confidence that had defined his 20 years in hospital administration was nowhere to be found. He slammed both hands onto the table. The sharp cracks silenced the few remaining whispers. "I need an answer." His voice echoed through the room. "The governor has already called twice. The press won't stop asking. They all want to know the same thing." His eyes swept across the room, stopping on doctors, department heads, and emergency responders, who saved all 57 victims. No one spoke. Outside the shattered windows, helicopters hovered above the smoking hospital, while television crews crowded behind police barricades. Flashing lights painted the walls blue and red as another ambulance slowly pulled away. Richard waited. Still nothing. His frustration grew stronger. Someone had organized the evacuation after the power failed. Someone had redirected intensive care patients before the oxygen system exploded. Someone had assigned rescue teams to every stairwell after the elevators stopped working. Someone had made hundreds of impossible decisions while the building burned around them. Yet nobody seemed willing to tell him who that person was. He turned toward Dr. Allen. "Brooks, Chief of Surgery. You were inside." The older surgeon slowly shook his head. "I reached the operating wing after the ceiling collapsed." Richard looked toward the emergency department supervisor. "What about you?" She swallowed hard. "I was trapped on the 4th floor until firefighters broke through a window." Richard clenched his jaw. Then who was giving the orders? Silence answered him again. Finally, Fire Captain Daniel Hayes stepped forward. His helmet rested beneath one arm. Dark soot covered the lines around his eyes. "We followed someone's instructions." Richard frowned. "Whose instructions?" The captain hesitated. "I never saw the person." "What do you mean you never saw them?" "We only heard the voice." Several firefighters quietly nodded. The voice kept coming through the smoke. "Move neonatal first. Use stairwell C. Shut down the oxygen valves. Keep the burn victims away from the east corridor." Every instruction came seconds before something else went wrong. Another firefighter spoke softly. It was like whoever was leading us already knew what the fire was going to do. The room grew even quieter. Richard rubbed his temples. This person just disappeared afterward? Captain Hayes looked toward the smoke rising outside the broken windows. "No. They never stayed in one place long enough to disappear. Every time we reached another floor, they had already gone somewhere else to save more people." Richard slowly lowered his eyes to the paperwork scattered across the conference table. One document sat on top of the pile. A disciplinary suspension, signed at 8:17 that very morning. His own signature stared back at him. "Employee suspended pending investigation. Emily Carter." For a moment, Richard barely remembered signing the document. It had seemed like another routine disciplinary decision. Nothing more. Across the room, two nurses exchanged uneasy glances before looking away. Neither of them noticed the smoke-covered identification badge lying beneath a chair. The badge belonged to Emily Carter. Before this day was over, every person in that room would learn that the nurse Richard Lawson had suspended only hours earlier had become the reason 57 families would still return home together. Emily Carter had never cared about titles. For nearly 14 years, she had worked the busiest shifts at Eastbridge Medical Center, usually arriving before sunrise and leaving long after darkness settled over the city. Most patients never remembered her name, but they always remembered the calm voice that greeted them during their worst moments. She believed that was enough. Every new nurse noticed the same thing within their first week. If something complicated happened, people instinctively looked for Emily. Not because she was the highest-ranking nurse. She wasn't. Not because she held an administrative position. She didn't. They looked at her because she never panicked. While others rushed, Emily slowed down. While others argued, she listened. While others searched for someone to blame, she searched for a solution. Years earlier, that quiet confidence had earned her respect. Lately, it had earned her enemies. Hospital administrators preferred employees who followed procedures without asking questions. Emily respected protocols, but she also understood something many executives had forgotten. Every emergency was different. Sometimes the handbook saved lives. Sometimes it delayed them. That belief often placed her in uncomfortable conversations with management, especially with Director Richard Lawson. 3 months before the fire, Emily had reported that the hospital's backup generators had failed 2 inspection tests. She submitted photographs, maintenance records, and written recommendations. The report disappeared. A month later, she warned that emergency evacuation maps posted throughout the building were outdated after the intensive care unit had been renovated. No action was taken. Then she requested another disaster drill. The request was denied because it would interrupt hospital operations. Emily stopped expecting anyone upstairs to listen, so she quietly trained her own team. Every Friday morning before patients arrived, she gathered a handful of nurses in unused hallways. They practiced moving unconscious patients without elevators. They memorized every emergency stairwell. They learned how to shut off oxygen valves. Some laughed at the extra training. Others rolled their eyes. One nurse joked that Emily acted as if she expected the building to catch fire every week. Emily simply smiled. I hope I'm wasting everyone's time. No one realized she meant every word. Her reputation around the hospital became complicated. Patients adored her. Doctors trusted her. New nurses admired her. Administrators called her difficult. The final disagreement happened on the very morning of the disaster. A maintenance supervisor informed Emily that another emergency generator inspection had been postponed. Again, she walked directly to Richard Lawson's office carrying the inspection reports. Richard barely looked up from his computer. What is it now, Emily? She placed the folder on his desk. The generators aren't ready. They haven't been ready for months. If we lose power during an emergency, people will die. Richard sighed heavily. We've already discussed this. No, you've dismissed it. The repairs are scheduled. They've been scheduled 3 times. Emily's voice remained calm. They keep getting delayed because of budget approvals. Richard finally stood. I have auditors arriving this afternoon. I don't have time for another debate. This isn't a debate. It's a warning. The room became silent. Richard crossed his arms. You've questioned administrative decisions repeatedly. You've ignored your chain of command. You've created unnecessary concern among the staff. Emily looked directly into his eyes. I created concern because there is something to be concerned about. Richard reached for a document already waiting on his desk. I think you need some time away from work. He signed the paper without another word. Administrative suspension pending investigation. Effective immediately. Emily accepted the document without arguing. She removed her identification badge and placed it carefully on the desk. I hope I'm wrong. Richard said nothing. She quietly turned toward the door. Just before leaving, she paused. If today becomes the day we all hope never comes. She looked back one final time. Please don't waste time. Looking for permission. Then she walked out of the office. Neither of them knew that less than 40 minutes later, black smoke would begin rising from the east wing of Eastbridge Medical Center. At 8:54 that morning, Eastbridge Medical Center was operating like any other weekday. The lobby was crowded with visitors carrying flowers and coffee cups. Nurses hurried between patient rooms while surgeons prepared for scheduled procedures. In the neonatal unit, newborn babies slept peacefully beneath warm lights. Down the hall, physical therapists guided elderly patients through slow morning exercises. No one noticed the first warning. It began as a faint burning smell inside the hospital's electrical control room. A maintenance technician assumed an overloaded circuit had tripped another breaker. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and headed downstairs, expecting a routine repair. Instead, he opened the door to find thick black smoke pouring from the main electrical panel. He reached for the emergency alarm. The lights went out before his hand touched it. Within seconds, the entire east wing fell into darkness. Backup generators were supposed to activate automatically. Nothing happened. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before panic replaced it. Ventilators began shutting down. Patient monitors flashed black. Elevators stopped between floors. Electronic doors locked without warning. Across the hospital, confused voices filled the hallways. What happened? Why is the power out? Call maintenance. Get the generators online. Doctors reached for emergency flashlights while nurses searched for portable oxygen tanks. Family members pulled out their phones, using flashlight beams to navigate through the growing darkness. Then came the second disaster. A violent explosion echoed from the basement. The blast shook windows across the building. Ceiling tiles crashed onto the floor. Smoke surged through ventilation shafts, spreading far faster than anyone expected. Within 2 minutes, entire corridors disappeared behind thick black clouds. The hospital's communication network failed almost instantly. Portable radios produced nothing but static. Telephone lines went dead. The public announcement system remained silent. For the first time in decades, Eastbridge Medical Center had no central command. Each department was completely on its own. On the front steps, Emily Carter had just reached the employee parking lot. Her suspension papers remained folded inside her jacket pocket. She heard the explosion before she saw the smoke. Every instinct she had developed over 14 years took over at once. She turned around. A massive column of black smoke climbed into the sky above the eastern wing. People were already running toward the exits. Others were running back inside, searching for loved ones. Emily stood frozen for only a second. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. No backup generator lights. No emergency power. Exactly what she had warned them about. She pulled out her phone and dialed the emergency dispatch center while running toward the entrance. This is Emily Carter from Eastbridge Medical Center. We've lost primary power. The generators failed. Assume multiple casualty conditions. The dispatcher immediately began sending additional rescue units. Emily ended the call before anyone could ask another question. A security officer recognized her as she reached the main doors. Emily, you can't go back in. You're suspended. She never slowed down. Then stop me. The guard hesitated. He looked toward the terrified patients pouring out of the building. He looked back at Emily. Without saying another word, he stepped aside. Inside, complete chaos had taken over. Patients screamed for help. Doctors shouted conflicting orders. Wheelchairs collided in smoke-filled hallways. Someone yelled that the intensive care unit had lost oxygen pressure. Another voice screamed that newborn babies were still trapped upstairs. Emily closed her eyes for one brief moment. She pictured every floor, every stairwell, every oxygen shutoff valve, every emergency route she had memorized during the drills no one believed they would ever need. When she opened her eyes again, the suspended nurse was gone. Only the leader remained. Then, with smoke closing around her and alarms finally beginning to scream through the darkness, Emily Carter ran straight into the burning hospital while everyone else was still trying to decide what to do. The moment Emily crossed the emergency entrance, the heat struck her like a wall. Smoke rolled through the first-floor corridor, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Fire alarms screamed overhead while the emergency lights flickered weakly against the thick haze. Somewhere above, terrified patients cried for help. Somewhere below, another explosion echoed through the building. Nobody was in control. Doctors shouted over one another. Nurses pushed stretchers in opposite directions. Several patients had been wheeled toward elevators that no longer worked. Emily understood something immediately. If everyone continued making their own decisions, dozens of people would die within minutes. She climbed onto the reception desk. Everyone, listen to me. Almost no one heard her. She grabbed a nearby metal oxygen stand and struck it against the desk. The loud crash cut through the chaos. Heads turned. Stop moving. Her voice carried across the lobby. For the next 30 seconds, nobody moves unless I tell you. The authority in her voice surprised everyone. Even the panic seemed to hesitate. Emily pointed toward 3 senior nurses. Melissa, take every patient who can walk. Use stairwell C only. She turned to 2 respiratory therapists. Portable oxygen. Every cylinder you can find goes to intensive care. Then she faced 4 security officers. Lock the east corridor. No one enters. The ceiling won't hold much longer. One officer frowned. Who put you in charge? Emily looked him directly in the eyes. Do you want to argue? Or do you want people to live? The officer answered by running. Within seconds, everyone else followed. No one cared about job titles anymore. They only cared that someone finally had a plan. Emily sprinted toward the intensive care unit. The hallway was almost completely dark. Only flashing emergency lights illuminated clouds of smoke drifting along the ceiling. Halfway there, she found 3 nurses struggling to move a ventilated patient. The bed was too large for the narrow emergency stairwell. "We can't get through." Emily immediately removed the side rails. "Take the mattress." "What?" "Leave the bed." The nurses stared at her. "The frame weighs over 300 pounds. The mattress doesn't move." Within moments, they lifted the patient onto the mattress and began sliding it carefully toward the stairwell. Precious minutes had been saved. Emily continued deeper into the building. She reached the intensive care unit just as 2 doctors attempted to restart dead ventilators. "They're gone," one doctor said. "We've lost power." Emily scanned the room. 12 patients. How many portable ventilators? 5. She made the decision instantly. Portable ventilators go to the youngest patients first. What about the others? Manual ventilation. The doctors exchanged worried glances. "It could take hours." Emily nodded. "Then we breathe for them." Without another word, she grabbed an ambu bag and began squeezing oxygen into an unconscious patient's lungs. One nurse joined her, then another. Soon every available clinician was manually keeping patients alive. Emily checked her watch. 7 minutes since the fire began. Smoke was getting thicker. The temperature inside the unit continued rising. Another nurse rushed toward her. "The neonatal ward is still full. Nobody can reach them." Emily froze for only a fraction of a second. The neonatal ward sat directly above the electrical room. If the fire spread upward, the babies would have almost no chance. She handed the ambu bag to a resident physician. "Don't stop." "What about you?" Emily looked toward the smoke-filled stairwell. "I'm going upstairs." The resident grabbed her arm. "Emily." "The suspension. If Richard finds out." Emily gently pulled free. "If Richard wants to suspend me again." She managed the smallest smile despite the smoke surrounding them. "He'll have to wait until everyone is breathing." Then she disappeared into the darkness, climbing toward the neonatal ward while flames continued spreading beneath her feet. The climb to the neonatal ward felt endless. Smoke poured down the stairwell with every passing second, forcing Emily to keep one hand over her mouth while gripping the railing with the other. The emergency lights blinked weakly through the haze, casting long shadows across the concrete walls. Halfway up, she heard coughing. A young orderly sat against the wall, struggling to breathe. "My leg," he gasped. "I can't move." Emily knelt beside him for only a moment. "Can you stand?" He shook his head. She grabbed the emergency radio clipped to his belt. "Stay here. Firefighters are coming." Before he could answer, she was already climbing again. Every second mattered. When Emily reached the neonatal ward, the scene stopped her cold. 6 nurses were desperately trying to comfort frightened parents, while 20 premature infants remained inside temperature-controlled incubators. Without electricity, every incubator had become a countdown. One nurse rushed toward her. "The backup batteries are almost dead." "How long?" "Maybe 5 minutes." Emily looked around the room. 20 babies. 6 nurses. No elevators. No working generators. She took one slow breath. Listen carefully. Everyone fell silent. "We're leaving the incubators." Several parents stared at her in disbelief. "What? You can't carry premature babies like that." Emily stepped closer. "If we stay here, none of them survive." Her calm voice somehow settled the panic. She pointed toward blankets stacked inside a storage cabinet. "Wrap every baby. Skin to skin if necessary. You keep them warm with your own body." One father looked terrified. "I've never even held my daughter." Emily gently placed the tiny infant into his trembling arms. "You already know how. You just don't believe it yet." Within 2 minutes, every parent carried a child against their chest. The nurses formed a protective line around them. Emily opened the fire door. Thick smoke immediately rushed inside. The stairwell had become the only escape. Single file. No running. If someone falls, everyone stops. The group began descending. Halfway down, another explosion shook the building. The lights went completely dark. Several parents screamed. One nurse lost her footing. Emily caught her before she could tumble down the stairs. "Keep moving." Her voice never changed. Steady. Controlled. Certain. Those 3 words became the only thing anyone trusted. As they reached the 2nd floor, a firefighter appeared through the smoke. "We've been looking everywhere. We can take over." Emily shook her head. Take the babies. The intensive care unit still needs help. The firefighter stared at her soot-covered face. Aren't you coming? She looked toward the upper floors where smoke continued pouring downward. Not yet. He followed her gaze. There's nobody left up there. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she looked at one of the pediatric nurses. How many patients were on the surgical floor this morning? The nurse's eyes widened. Oh no, 7 post-op patients. And 2 orthopedic cases. They can't walk. Emily nodded once. Exactly as she feared. Everyone had been so focused on intensive care and the newborns that an entire recovery ward had been forgotten. The firefighter grabbed her shoulder. The structure isn't stable anymore. Emily looked directly at him. If your family were still upstairs. She paused. Would you leave? The firefighter slowly released his grip. Without another word, he turned toward his rescue crew. You heard her. We're going back up. Emily watched them disappear into the smoke. Then she tightened the strap of a discarded oxygen cylinder over her shoulder. Her lungs burned. Her uniform was soaked with sweat. Her suspension papers were still folded inside her pocket. None of it mattered. Somewhere above her, 9 patients were still waiting. And Emily Carter had no intention of letting them become the first names on today's casualty list. The surgical recovery ward was almost unrecognizable. Smoke filled every corridor, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Water poured from broken sprinkler pipes, mixing with shattered glass across the floor. The emergency lights had finally gone dark, leaving only thin beams from firefighters' flashlights cutting through the black haze. Emily counted every door as she moved. Room 601. Empty. Room 603. Already evacuated. Room 605. A frightened elderly woman sat alone in her bed, still connected to an enforced stand. I thought everyone forgot me, she whispered. Emily smiled despite the burning in her lungs. Not today. She disconnected the 4, wrapped a blanket around the woman's shoulders, and guided her toward the stairwell, where 2 firefighters immediately took over. One down, Emily said quietly. She turned back toward the smoke. Room 607. A post-operative patient lay unconscious after abdominal surgery. The man weighed nearly twice as much as Emily. Moving him alone was impossible. Leaving him behind was not an option. She searched the room and spotted a heavy evacuation sheet beneath the mattress. Working quickly, she rolled the patient onto the sheet, secured the straps, and began dragging him across the flooded floor. Every pull felt heavier than the last. Halfway to the hallway, another explosion echoed somewhere below. The lights from the firefighters disappeared for a moment. The building groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling. One firefighter shouted through the smoke. The floor is becoming unstable. Emily didn't stop. Together, they dragged the unconscious man into the stairwell just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind them. Chunks of concrete smashed onto the empty hospital bed. The room disappeared beneath smoke and debris. The firefighter stared back in disbelief. Another 30 seconds. Emily simply nodded. Keep moving. Minutes later, only 6 patients remained. She checked every room herself. One by one, they were carried, dragged, or supported toward the emergency stairs. Doctors who had argued with one another earlier now worked silently beside nurses. Police officers carried wheelchairs. Firefighters pushed stretchers. No one asked who was in charge anymore. They already knew. As Emily reached the final room, she stopped. The door was closed. Inside, an elderly man remained connected to multiple monitors powered by rapidly failing backup batteries. He opened his eyes as she entered. I knew someone would come. Emily walked to his bedside. We're getting you out. He smiled weakly. You look tired. She laughed softly. I'll rest tomorrow. Together with 2 firefighters, she transferred him onto an evacuation sled. The hallway outside had become nearly impassable. Flames now stretched across the ceiling, forcing everyone to crouch low as they moved. Heat pressed against their backs like an invisible wall. Halfway to the stairs, Emily heard another cry. Faint. Almost impossible to hear beneath the alarms. She stopped. One firefighter grabbed her arm. We've got the last patient. No. Emily listened again. There. A child's voice. Very weak. Coming from the pediatric imaging department across the hall. The firefighter looked toward the flames. That section was already cleared. Emily shook her head. Someone is still inside. Without waiting for permission, she pulled a wet blanket over her shoulders and sprinted through the smoke. The firefighters shouted after her. She disappeared before they could stop her. Inside the imaging department, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Emily followed the frightened sobs until she found a small storage room. Curled beneath a desk sat a little girl no older than 7, clutching a stuffed rabbit with both hands. Her eyes widened through the smoke. I couldn't find my mommy. Emily knelt beside her. You found me instead. She lifted the child into her arms. Then she turned toward the burning hallway, knowing the hardest part of the rescue had only just begun. Emily held the little girl tightly against her chest as flames spread across the ceiling. The stuffed rabbit remained trapped beneath the child's arm. I don't want to die, the little girl whispered. Emily adjusted the wet blanket around both of them. You're not going to. The words sounded calm, certain, as though they were a promise instead of a hope. She stepped back into the hallway. The heat was worse than before. Black smoke swallowed every emergency exit sign. Pieces of burning insulation drifted through the air like glowing snow. Emily could barely see 10 feet ahead. She lowered herself to one knee. Stay close to my shoulder. The little girl nodded without speaking. Together they crawled beneath the smoke. Halfway down the corridor, a loud cracking sound echoed through the building. Emily looked up just in time to see a section of ceiling begin to collapse. She threw herself over the child. Concrete, glass, and burning debris crashed onto the floor only inches away. The impact knocked both of them sideways. Pain shot through Emily's left shoulder. She ignored it. Are you hurt? The little girl shook her head. My bunny is okay. Emily smiled. So are you. She lifted the child again and continued moving. As they reached the stairwell, Captain Daniel Hayes rushed upward with 3 firefighters. There you are. We thought we lost you. Emily handed him the girl. Take her outside. What about you? Emily looked back toward the smoke. One last sweep. The captain stared at her in disbelief. The building is coming apart. She knew he was right. The radio clipped to his vest suddenly crackled. Command to all interior units. Structural failure is imminent. Evacuate immediately. Every firefighter froze. Those words meant the operation was over. No rescue was worth risking additional lives. Captain Hayes looked at Emily. You heard the order. She slowly nodded. Then she asked a single question. Has every floor been cleared? The captain hesitated. We think so. You think? Neither of them liked that answer. Emily grabbed a floor map hanging beside the stairwell. Her finger moved quickly across the building layout. Emergency department. Clear. Intensive care. Clear. Recovery ward. Clear. Neonatal. Clear. Then her hand stopped. Radiology archive. A basement storage area connected to the imaging department. No evacuation mark. She looked at Captain Hayes. Who checked the archive? Silence. No one answered. One firefighter quietly lowered his eyes. We couldn't reach it after the second explosion. Emily folded the map. Then nobody knows. Captain Hayes stepped directly in front of her. No, I'm not letting you go back. You've done enough. Emily looked past him toward the smoke. My job isn't finished. It's not your job anymore. She smiled sadly. It never stopped being my job. Before anyone could react, she slipped past the firefighters and disappeared into the dark hallway once again. Captain Hayes cursed under his breath. 2 volunteers with me. One firefighter immediately stepped forward. So did another. Within seconds they were running after her. Outside the hospital, rescue crews watched fresh flames burst through several third-floor windows. The crowd gasped. Television cameras captured every terrifying second. Near the ambulance line, Richard Lawson arrived from the emergency command center. He stared at the burning building in horror. Someone handed him an updated patient count. He scanned the page. 56 survivors. Richard frowned. That's impossible. I was told everyone made it out. A paramedic looked toward the burning hospital. They almost did. One nurse went back inside. Richard's face tightened. Who? The paramedic answered without looking away from the flames. Emily Carter. Richard Lawson stood motionless as another section of the hospital roof collapsed. The explosion shook the ground beneath everyone's feet. Television cameras captured firefighters retreating from the entrance while thick black smoke poured through broken windows. Police officers pushed reporters farther behind the barricades as another ambulance raced toward the emergency triage area. Richard barely noticed any of it. Only one sentence echoed inside his head. Emily Carter, the nurse he had suspended less than 2 hours earlier. He grabbed Captain Hayes the moment the firefighter emerged from the building. Where is she? The captain removed his helmet slowly. Still inside. Richard felt the color drain from his face. What do you mean still inside? She went back. Again. For who? The captain looked toward the burning structure. We don't know. Richard took one step toward the entrance. I'm going in. Two police officers immediately stopped him. It's too dangerous. Richard struggled against them. I have people in there. Captain Hayes placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Sir, if she comes out, it'll be because she found her own way. Before Richard could answer, every radio on the scene crackled at once. Interior Team 3 to command. The transmission was broken by heavy static. We found another burst of interference. Archive room. Then silence. Everyone froze. Captain Hayes grabbed his radio. Repeat your last transmission. Nothing. He tried again. Team 3, respond. Still nothing. Several agonizing seconds passed. Then a weak voice returned. We have survivors. Relief swept across the command post. How many? The answer came through the static. One maintenance worker. One volunteer. And another pause. Captain Hayes closed his eyes. And Nurse Carter. Richard let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Minutes later, firefighters emerged through the smoke carrying 3 people. The maintenance worker was unconscious. The volunteer firefighter had burns across both arms. Emily walked behind them. Barely. Her uniform was black with soot. One sleeve had been burned almost completely away. Blood ran from a cut above her eyebrow. She coughed violently, but refused the stretcher waiting nearby. Instead, she turned around. Is everyone accounted for? A paramedic blinked. You need oxygen. Emily ignored him. Answer me. Captain Hayes checked the latest evacuation board. He slowly nodded. 57. Everyone. Only then did Emily allow herself to sit on the curb. A paramedic placed an oxygen mask over her face. Richard approached cautiously. For several moments, he couldn't find the words. Emily looked up. Even exhausted, her expression remained calm. I assume my suspension still stands. Richard stared at her. She had just risked her life to save dozens of strangers. Yet she was joking about losing her job. His throat tightened. The words refused to come. Before he could speak, one of the emergency physicians hurried toward them carrying a clipboard. We finished the patient count. Richard accepted the report. He read every line carefully. 57 patients evacuated. 0 civilian fatalities. 0 staff fatalities. His hands began trembling. The physician looked at him. Director, we also reviewed the rescue timeline. Richard slowly raised his eyes. Who coordinated the evacuation? The physician answered without hesitation. Every witness gave the same name. Several firefighters standing nearby quietly nodded. So did every nurse. So did every doctor. Richard already knew what they were going to say. Still, hearing it aloud felt like a punch to the chest. The nurse you suspended. For the second time that day, complete silence filled the air. This time, no one looked at Emily. Every eye in the command center turned toward Richard Lawson instead. N01 spoke. The words hung in the smoky afternoon air like a final verdict. The nurse you suspended. Richard Lawson looked at Emily Carter, still sitting on the curb with an oxygen mask resting loosely against her face. Paramedics continued cleaning the cuts on her hands while firefighters silently packed away burned equipment nearby. She looked exhausted. Not victorious. Not proud. Simply exhausted. Richard took one slow step toward her. Then another. For the first time in his career, he had no prepared speech. No policy to quote. No report to hide behind. Only the truth. He stopped in front of her. I'm sorry. Emily looked up, surprised by how quietly he had spoken. Richard swallowed hard. I should have listened. You warned me about the generators. You warned me about the evacuation routes. You asked for more disaster drills. I ignored every one of them. Emily remained silent. Around them, dozens of employees had stopped working. Doctors, nurses, firefighters, police officers. Every conversation faded as people watched the exchange. Richard reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. The suspension order. His signature still covered the bottom of the page. Without saying another word, he slowly tore the document into small pieces. The paper drifted onto the pavement. I can't undo what happened this morning. He looked directly into Emily's eyes. But I can admit that I was wrong. Emily removed the oxygen mask. You don't owe me an apology. Richard frowned. I absolutely do. She gently shook her head. You owe this hospital a promise. He waited. Fix what nearly killed those people. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Richard looked back at the burned hospital. She was right. The fire had started because of electrical failure. The disaster had become catastrophic because emergency systems failed. Lives had been saved not by perfect planning, but by the determination of ordinary people who refused to leave anyone behind. Emily had simply been the first to act. Captain Hayes stepped beside them. We reviewed the helmet cameras. Richard turned toward him. The entire evacuation is on video. So are the radio recordings. The timeline matches every witness statement. Captain Hayes smiled faintly. Your nurse never stopped moving. Every floor, every corridor, every decision. Richard looked back at Emily. Why? She seemed confused by the question. Why what? Why did you go back? You had already been suspended. You could have walked away. Emily watched firefighters continue searching through the smoking ruins. When people need help, she paused. They don't stop being my patients because someone signed a piece of paper. No one around her could think of a response. Late that evening, every major news station carried the same headline. Who saved all 57 victims? The answer spread across television screens, newspapers, and social media within hours. Not a famous surgeon. Not the hospital director. Not a government official. A nurse. One who had quietly spent years preparing for the emergency everyone else believed would never happen. Weeks later, Eastbridge Medical Center reopened after extensive repairs. Emergency generators were replaced. Disaster procedures were rewritten. Mandatory evacuation drills became part of every department. Near the main entrance, a simple bronze plaque was mounted on the wall. It did not mention medals. It did not mention heroism. It carried only one sentence. Respect is earned by the choices you make when everyone else is waiting for someone to lead. Every employee who entered the building passed those words. And none of them ever forgot the day a suspended nurse reminded an entire hospital what real leadership looked like.